Donald Trump is that he says it's to Maduro and Maduro chooses to go voluntarily. Because when it comes to forced regime change, that's something that makes parts of the MAGA coalition really uneasy.
So, Katie, there seems to be a scandal brewing, clamour rising about this double tap strike on narcos coming out of Venezuela. Pete Hegseth's involved in it. Where have we got to on that?
Yeah, so this all comes down to talk of a double airstrike and the sense that Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, put out this kill everyone order, which created quite a stir. You had Donald Trump being asked about it and saying, Pete Hegseth has told me X. Then we had a press briefing where Caroline Leavitt appeared to confirm that there had been, in fact, two strikes when it comes to a suspected drug boat. And her point being, yes, there were two strikes, but this was carried out in self defense. And she said that Admiral Frank Bradley gave the order for a second strike, and that was well within his authority and the law. But certainly, I think the events leading up to this and how it's been reported in some publications, there's been a sense is this war crime to have a second strike when you have, two survivors on the boat and then to go again. Some confusion from the president about what exactly had happened over the past 24 hours, and then a seeming clarification from the White House press secretary and a defense saying this is all within the law. And I think all this touches on a sense which is when it comes to the White House administration's approach to Venezuela, is this something which is within international law or US law, or is this something else?
Or do they actually not care? Which is probably the answer, because you say a suspected drug boat. This is not a clear and present terrorist threat, which is presumably where the authority lies. If someone is about to blow up a bomb in the centre of New York, of course there should be executive authority to take them out before they do that. This is someone who you suspect is a drug dealer, and then the executive authority is being used to kill them extrajudicially. And there'll be, I imagine, lots of people in America who say that is not what the use of executive powers like this should be for.
Well, that's the question, which is if you strike a boat and there are two survivors, which is what's being reported in this case, and then you do a double strike to take them out, what risk were they posing in terms of an immediate risk on the country? Now, the response of the White House is that you look at narco terrorists, you look at the war on drugs, if you look at fentanyl in America, it means that they have the right to eradicate anyone in that sphere in one of these countries that they think is a threat to them. We already know there's some unhappiness in Congress on these points. So there were, you had some Republicans, but largely Democrats raising concerns, a month or so ago, but not enough to actually change the laws to bind the administration's hands on this. So they have a pretty much free hand in terms of navigate this at the moment. And I think that broadly speaking, while there are questions being asked about law, the Republican Party is still enough behind Donald Trump to see where he is going on this. I think the problem is potentially coming up on what is the end game when it comes to Venezuela, because we know that the Make America Great Again movement is not particularly into forever wars. They don't really like wars, but they do like the war on drugs. They see that as a war close to home. When that war on drugs and, taking down cartels crosses into regime change, that's when parts of the coalition start to break down. And I think that's what probably the coming weeks are going to tell us.
It's an interesting philosophical point, anyway, because if a drug dealer is a threat to the nation, why can't you just walk around the streets of American cities offering people and saying it's in the spirit of defending the nation, which is a point I'm sure is being made. So how keen on
I think they
regime
would
change?
probably say that drug dealers in America are one thing compared to drug dealers in
Well, yeah.
the Americas. But of course, I see your point, and then you have the ice raids on top of that. But I think there's definitely something which is if you look at how the US is in many ways trying to retreat in terms of its reach, in terms of what
Yeah.
lays is policing other people's borders, and that touches on to what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. The counter to that is they're getting, in a way, more interventionish in their own backyard.
Yeah.
So the Americas, because they think that's actually one which is it has more of a direct impact actually
So
take
how
away
far are they going to take
rhetoric.
that, Kate? I guess that's the question then, because there's reports that he's had a conversation with Maduro, the president of Venezuela, giving him an ultimatum to stand down. Because there's one thing saying we're gonna get rid of these boats that are threatening our national security. If the next stage is you have to resign, or what, we might invade you, we might support an uprising against you. How far has that gone? How far do you know what Trump thinks about that and what he said to Maduro and what might follow next?
But I think it starts to potentially get very messy in a way that ideal scenario for Donald Trump is that he says it's to Maduro and Maduro chooses to go voluntarily.
Yeah.
Because when it comes to forced regime change, that's something that makes parts of the MAGA coalition really uneasy. You have your Steve Bannons of this world. You have probably some figures within the cabinet. You think, Venezuela is a big country. This is not going to be a clean act if you actually try and force someone out against their will. You also then, on one hand, have people like Marco Rubio, who are, son of Cuban immigrants, and very passionate on this cause. You also have Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, pushing it. So there is a chance this actually, does go up another level. But I think the cleanest situation at this point would be trying to convince Maduro he should actually walk
But why would he
away.
do that? Why would an authoritarian boss of a country just say, "Oh, I'm walking away from this all"?
I think it would only be if they felt like it was too high risk for them to stay there. And
Yeah,
it's not clear yet they're at that point. Now, we just don't know.
yeah,
But the problem is if they don't choose to go, I've spoken to lots of figures who do not like the Maduro regime, who also say that it would be a very, very messy thing for America to get too involved in this. But
yeah.
then we also know where Rubio sits. He's one of them who are pushing it, as is Stephen Miller. So I think it's also, if you think about Donald Trump's foreign policy, so much of it is, and he said this himself, he thinks the biggest problem with American foreign policy of previous decades is the fact that too often they say what they're going to do and there's no surprise. And therefore, it
Oh,
is quite hard to read exactly what he's going to do from this, if we're being honest, because part of his act is this whole art of the deal of trying to keep your opponent guessing. So, is this a
yeah.
game of bravado to try and bounce Maduro into leaving Venezuela? Or does he actually have a plan for further action if that fails?
That's so interesting, Katie. Before you go, you mentioned Ukraine. Where are we then? Talks continuing. What you're hearing from the Washington end of that?
So we now know we're going into in what is quite obviously ongoing negotiations with the initial 28-point peace plan, which was more to the side of Moscow, to now a 19-point peace plan, now more to Ukraine. Now we know that there's been further talks to Ukraine, and as of tomorrow, it's going more back to Moscow. So we are expecting a situation whereby Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and others will be meeting, and the White House said they're very optimistic, but meeting with President Putin in Moscow to go over parts of this deal. I think the big question for everyone really is, where are the main concessions? We know the Ukrainians are very concerned about some of those land swaps. Also some things around Russian language. Lots of those points seemingly went away last week. But the question is Russia okay with them going away? So I think
Yeah,
we're really entering the rub of whether this is, um, you know, the blueprint of the ceasefire in the Middle East, where you had the property moguls, if we're being honest, of Witkoff and Kushner come in, fusing business and politics together in a way which meant that some of these countries where in the past Western leaders have been far more moralistic, perhaps
yeah.
speaking more of a language to these countries and getting somewhere, or actually, in the case of the Ukraine Russia war, are the sides just too far apart for this to work? And I think the next week or so is going to tell us that.
And that is exactly the question. We shall see what happens. Katie, as ever, great to speak to you. Thank you so much.